No mai, haere mai ki te hui tēnei rā. Ko Waio, ko Katrina Coleman tōku ingoa, here National Educator, whanau whina ora tokatonga mahi. And I am here with an amazing guest, Dr. Boroff, and Bill and I are going to have a conversation with you about how to keep tamariki safe at home, around the home, outside of the home, in every possible place that they could be. So, Bill, would you like to introduce yourself?
Good morning, everybody. Hey there. My name is Bill Boroff. I am a physician. I'm an ER doctor, and then I'm also a medical toxicologist. So I'm a doc that essentially specializes in poisonings, and I'm the deputy director here of the National Poison Center.
Wow, that's an interesting area of specialty. How did you get into
that? There's not too many of us in the world. There's only 2 of us in the whole country, as it is, and it's just me being very interested in very nerdy things related to chemicals and what they do with the body. So it's a natural offshoot from emergency medicine, and
Sure.
just a very neat one. Yeah.
Wow, that's fascinating. Hey, thank you so much for coming along, and thank you to all of you at home who are joining us, or those who might be joining us after the fact. It's great to have you here. I'll talk a little bit about what we're going to cover in today's session, so you know what is coming up. We're going to talk about child development and how development can impact safety practices around the home. We're going to talk about why it's important to keep chemicals in their original containers. We're going to talk about ingestion risks or risks of swallowing around the home. We're going to talk about gaining an awareness around imported goods, things that we buy online from like Temu or Shein, places that might have quite different safety regulations than we are used to in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We're going to talk about safety around pharmaceuticals or drugs or medicine, as you might call it at home. We're going to talk about advice for visiting when you're out and about, when you're at maybe grandparents' houses, and how things are not always as child safe as they could be for our tamariki. And then finally, we're going to talk about breastfeeding mama. So without further ado, let's get into it. Firstly, we're going to talk a little bit about child development in relation to this topic. So can you tell me about, there are things that are put in place to support, the safety of our tamariki, things like, child safety caps, right, Bill?
Yeah, there's all sorts of different things that are out there that are available for kids to help with them from safety. The thing to know about children is obviously they are designed to grow and to learn and to develop. And your kid is always smarter than any other kid, right? And so your kid will always meet those milestones and exceed those milestones. And we have very certain sort of ages in which kids can, start to develop very specific behaviors that put them at risk for poisoning exposure. And that's where some of these safety considerations really come into play, right? And so the big things that we talk about with respect to child safe lids on things, or child safety caps or child resistant closures, is that they're designed in a way to try to overcome some of the dexterity that kids would have at certain developmental milestones.
Right.
But as they get older, they become better at figuring out problems, and kids are natural problem solvers. And so they are not to be considered a foolproof method of safety, ultimately.
Right. So even though, say, my bleach that I might use to clean my bathroom has got a childproof cap on it, maybe it's not the best place to store it under the sink in the kitchen.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, and kids are so good at figuring out problems, and probably even more so today than they were 20 years ago. Right. And so kids want to find problems. They want to solve those problems. And child safety caps are just one of those games that they can get into. Right. And it's important to note that as they're designed, the whole regulation behind these child safety caps doesn't mean that they don't have to pass 100% safety as it is anyway. There only has to be an 80% sort of success in deterring a kid from getting into a calf. So there's a margin of risk that's involved with them just by design.
Yeah, right. I see. Gosh, that's tricky, isn't it? And then you have, younger developmentally aged children who often are orally fixated and want to put things inside their mouths.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. And so that starts at around 6 months of age when kids start taking things from hand to mouth, sometimes a little bit earlier than that also. And a lot of that is because that's how they explore their world is hand to mouth,
right.
right? The tongue has all sorts of really interesting sensory components to it. And so that's the way that they explore their world. And then as they get older, that then morphs to modeled behavior. And so kids learn by doing as much as they do by seeing. And so if they see someone do something, then they're going to explore the world by doing that same sort of modeled behavior, which is another source of potential risk.
Yeah, I remember a story that stuck with me when I was working in the emergency department as a nurse in Taupo. And we had a young boy come in with a laceration, fortunately not a very serious one. He was probably only about 2 or 3, but he had a laceration on his hand. And he'd watched his parents open the Raro sachet for their juice using a knife. And so he'd done the same thing. He'd gone in, about 2 or 3, gone into the top drawer, got the Raro sachet, grabbed the knife, and of course didn't have that same control and ended up with a laceration. So
Yeah, no, and I think that's an important point is that just because they're going to model the behavior doesn't mean that they have that same dexterity or that same control. And so where you may take and tip back and take a sip of something and be able to control that as an adult, a kiddo doesn't have that ability to have that fine coordination. And so to them, a modeled sip could turn into a dangerous mouthful.
yeah, right. Especially if depending on what it is that they're drinking.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I suppose that goes for siblings as well. A lot of our young tamariki have older siblings who are modeling different behaviors around, some not so great behaviors like vaping and things like that. What are some things around vaping that we might need to be aware of with younger tamariki?
So the obvious one is that they'll model inhalation of the vape and they'll model putting it in their mouth and breathing in. And we get calls about that pretty regularly.
I bet.
And so yeah, so that's one thing, and that's an easy modeling behavior um, to see how kids would end up doing that. The other thing, though, that I think is of more importance when it comes to vaping is for refillable rigs that you have refillable vape devices, is the
Uh,
manipulation of that refill container, or even the disassembly of your particular device to fill up the chamber. That behavior is being observed by kids as well. And if it's something that's kept in your purse or kept out on the bench top, or next to the bed or something, then kids will see that
yeah.
and say, "Oh, I saw mom and dad do this and turn this and play with this, and something happened." And they do that. And now suddenly they've got all of this nicotine juice that is, spilling everywhere. And
Yeah,
so it's
right.
all of the steps of a thing that can be modeled that are important to keep in mind.
Yeah, and I suppose the same would go with taking medication. There are lots of medications that we take regularly as adults, some adults more than others. But if we're modeling, taking medication every day, that's probably something that would look quite appealing to a little person.
You're absolutely right. And so that's again, kids are always watching. That's the thing to always keep in mind. Kids are always watching. And so they'll see that sort of stuff. And they'll see you reach into the handbag and pull out the pocket of pills. They'll see you open the drawer and pull out the packet of pills or open the medicine cabinet or things like that. And so that is a thing that now they are going to model. And that makes it even more potentially challenging if we use phrases that are potentially attractive to kids when taking our own medication. So if you say, "Oh, dad needs to take his candy right now," or "Grandma's got to take her candy." That's the one that my grandma always did. She's got to take her candy right now. The minute that you've used that phrase, you've now encoded a relationship between medicine equals candy and candy equals tasty and all of these
Right.
things. You can see how that turns into an unfortunate cycle potentially.
Yeah, absolutely. And even that forbidden fruit, this is something only mummy can take, only mummy can have this, not you. You can't have this. It almost fuels that the interest in whatever it is.
Oh, sure, absolutely. So, yeah, so it's one of those things where, you know, in ideal circumstances, taking the medication out of the view of a child is probably a great way of reducing a lot of that risk of model behavior and
Yeah.
exploratory ingestions and things of that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so what do I do if I come into the bedroom and I think, oh my gosh, I've left, I don't know, my oral contraceptive pill on the nightstand next to my bed, and I see my toddler there standing there next to it, and I don't know if they've taken some, but she's holding the packet, like, what should I
Yeah.
do?
Yeah, it's good to sort of look and see, and try to really get a good assessment of what's happened around there, and take a few minutes to really look and see if you can find if there's pills missing. Look and see if you can figure out where they're at. Do a
Yeah.
good, take a moment to think back. All right, when did I get this? Is there a chance that I've actually taken these pills or not? But if there's any question whatsoever, that's what the National Poison Center is for, right? And we have 24-hour free of
Wow.
charge access. Even if you don't have minutes on your phone, we've got contracted with all cell phone providers that you can call the National Poison Center regardless. And so there's no barrier to getting in touch with us. We're always here, and we have trained specialists in poisons information that are always ready to take your call, that can help with these questions of,
Yeah.
is this a problem? Is this not a problem?
And that's
Um,
the thing, because when something like that happens, you often go into this like, fight or flight space where you can't think logically about like, no, there are no pills that have gone out of the packet, or whatever it might be. So I suppose someone at the poison center can help sort of calm you down and help you think rationally about, like what to do and what the next steps might be.
Absolutely. We have experts in this field, and that is their entire job, is to help get everything, put it in perspective, turn down the tone a little bit, get those questions that you may not even think to ask, so that we can help risk stratify or triage this. And the thing
Mm.
to note is that, sometimes we're busier than others. And there may be a little bit of a wait time that you may have if you do call the line. But in most instances, that time that you take waiting, if you're on hold, and it's uncommon, but it's just an important thing to throw out there, is still
Sure.
less time than it would take for you to bundle up your tamariki and put them in the car and drive down to your med center and all of that sort of stuff. So,
Yeah.
so we are there, and we are there to support anyone at any point in time.
Fantastic. So we talked a little bit about medicines. We'll talk more about that later on. But I'm interested in the idea of chemicals. So other things that we have stored, whether it be cleaners, whether it be chemicals that we use in like indoor plants or in our garden outside. Why is it important that we keep those chemicals in the containers that they came in?
Yeah, this is another major thing that we get called about, is that people will buy chemicals of some kind, be it a cleaning product or something for the garden, like you're saying,
Mhm.
and it comes in a big thing, and it's a little unwieldy. We want our value and we buy the big thing, but it's hard to sort of manage that. And so people will go and they'll very commonly put it into a smaller, more manageable container. And that becomes
Right.
very problematic, right? It's for two reasons. Number one, it's now you have an unlabeled container, so you don't know what's in it. And potentially, if you get rid of the bigger container, now you have a complete mystery chemical that you may not know what it is 6 weeks or 6 months from now, right? And number
Right.
two, the most common thing that we see people put these in are like drink containers, right? It's everyone's got a plastic bottle at home. I've got my Coca-Cola bottle here with water in it. Now that's problematic. I shouldn't have shown that. But you can see it's a common,
Good
this is a common
illustration.
thing, right? Yeah, exactly. It's illustration. But so it's a normal thing for people to want to reach for to do that. But it becomes a real problem, because let's say this wasn't just water and this was bleach. It looks the same, right? And so if I did this 6 months ago and it's in a drink vessel, then I'm not going to, for whatever reason, think that this could be a chemical, right? And so that's the adult in me, right? The kid in me
Yeah,
sees
of
this and
course.
says, that's a drink container. It has drinks in it, and I will drink it, right? And I know that it's
Mm,
okay to drink out of bottles because I've been given these drink bottles before, right?
yeah,
So you can
right.
see how that becomes a really, really big problem potentially.
Yeah. And I suppose even with with bottles that have the correct labeling on them, um, kids can't read what the labels
Right.
say necessarily. So they might see something that looks pretty and vibrant and bright and be attracted to drinking it.
I would agree. And I like to play this game where I go into the hardware store or I'll go into the cleaning section and try to pretend, what if I didn't speak the language on this label? Would I look
Right.
at this and think, is this juice or is this not? And that's probably a really good exercise for people to have when you're buying something that's a cleaning product. And then thinking
Mm,
about where you're going to store this is ask yourself, if I couldn't read, would I think this is juice? And if the answer is yes, then that's something that needs to be stored in an entirely different area than where the tamariki could get to.
yeah. And I suppose that what it comes down to is that kids can't drink what they can't reach.
Exactly. No, 100%. So
Yeah.
it always
Yeah.
boggles my mind that we store these things under sinks, which is right at toddler level, right? And it's exactly where they
Mm,
want to go. Um, and really where we should be putting them is well up and out of reach, where so that they can't easily get to it. And if it's hard for you to get to it, then that's a good sign, right? That you've probably picked a good location for it. And to be fair, you're not using this stuff, well, maybe people are better at cleaning their house than I am. I'm not using these things on a daily basis, and so to have it
mm.
within easy access is probably not really all that necessary.
Yeah, yeah, and that's important to think of. Like my tamariki are 7 and 9 now. They have progressed through the age, thankfully, you know, um, of drinking things that are under the sink. But that being said, they're not the only tamariki who come to my home. I still have,
Yeah.
nieces who are toddlers, and so you kind of can get a bit relaxed about some of that stuff. But actually, you have to think about all of the people who might be coming to your home.
Yes. No, I think that's a very, very, very good point. Is just because you're sort of out of the woods, if you will, doesn't mean that you can relax those good practice standards for sure.
Mm, mm. Okay.
Yeah.
And I think one trick I always used to use when I was a plunket nurse in practice is I would say, to parents, get down on the floor and have a look around at what the hazards are, get down to the child's level, because it's amazing what you see when you're at the child's level. And I think it's that same thing. Even if developmentally your baby is not moving or crawling yet, try and always be one developmental step ahead of where your tamariki is, to think, okay, so what's coming up and what do I need to do to make sure that the house and everything in it is safe for Pepe.
I love that. I love that practice, and that's something that I also recommend to families when it comes to baby proofing the household. And I think your point is really well taken, that you want to be ahead of the kids, right? Once
Mm,
the once the baby is up and crawling around, right? That's not the time that you say, okay, now I have to childproof things, because you never, like, these milestones are not set in stone. They're not reading the manual and
no,
saying, okay, I'm 9 months now, I should be able to crawl around.
yeah.
They will surprise you. And so you're exactly right. Being well ahead of this is great. Now, do you have to have the child locks on everything the day that you bring baby home from the hospital? No, but within reason, I think is great. And so within
Sure.
that first 3 month window, that fourth trimester that we sort of talk about in medicine, that's the time to say, okay, by the end of this period, I really do need to have the risk assessment of everything taken care of. I need to have the child locks on things. I need to have the stuff out of the way, because I don't know how advanced my kid's going to be. And
Mm.
we always hope our kids are going to, outpace them, outpace us in their development and things like that. So be optimistic about how fast they're going to develop.
Yeah, yeah. And I've heard it countless times, in a different risk space around, I didn't think that my baby could roll until the day they rolled off the bed. or yeah, I didn't think they could get out of this space until they got out of it the first time. So it is really about that. What's coming up next? What do we need to prepare as a household? And again, for subsequent children, when you've been through it all before, it's easy to forget that, the second one, we've taken all the baby locks off, but actually the second one's getting to that age now when they're going to start exploring a little bit more developmentally and getting into things. So yeah, just always trying to be mindful of being that one step ahead.
Well, and I think one last point to that is don't assume that just because your first kid, if you have multiple children, don't assume that the behaviors of the first one will be the behaviors of the second one. And I have 3 kids myself. Each one of them is as different from the other as they could possibly be. And my first one never explored anything in the cabinets, and the second one was pulling things out all the time, right? And so so it is an important thing that they are all going to be different, and prepare for them to be as mischievous as possible, and then you'll be okay.
Yeah, I like that. Okay, mischievous preparation. All right. Alrighty, so one of the most obvious risks around the home, and we've talked about a little bit already, is around medicines and the chemicals that are inside of the medicines when tamariki ingest it. What are some of those key things for whānau to be aware of?
So yeah, I'll start with the one that everyone calls about that is fortunately of little risk, and it's those little silica packets that come in everything, right? That say do not eat, right? We get calls about that all the time. Fortunately, I'll let everyone breathe a sigh of relief. Those aren't toxic. Those are the little beads that are inside. Those are fine. The packet themselves represents a choking hazard, right? Because it's a big packet and kids choke on big things. But those aren't toxic. So that's, so rest assured that that's okay there. So we'll talk about that elephant but the other ones that I think are a thing that people maybe don't think about that they should think about is toothpaste specifically that has fluoride in it. Because kid toothpaste is flavored in relatively palatable flavors. And so kids don't often do it, but they still can. And we get calls about it of taking the tube of toothpaste and having a snack from that. So it's good to make sure you keep that up out of the way. Yeah, sounds tasty, doesn't it? And then we've talked about vapes already. Reed diffusers and anything with an essential oil is another thing that we don't really think about as being a problem. But if you think about how we use those, really it's a glass vessel that has a liquid in it, and it smells really good, right? And so kids, again, being what they are, they're attracted to things that smell good, and they like to explore with their mouth. It's a very frequent thing that we'll get calls that the kid got to the Reed diffuser and drank the liquid that was in it, right? And those are problematic because those oils that are in there's a bunch of different kind of essential oils that exist, but some of them can actually be pretty dangerous. And on top of that, they can get into the lungs, and they can cause some issues with breathing and choking and all of that. And so those are something that should be really paid attention to.
Yeah, and up out of the way. So often they're on bench tops or on coffee tables or.
Yeah, you're right. The coffee table Reed diffuser is probably not a good choice. Yeah, if you've got a bookshelf, put it on top of the bookshelf or something like that, so it's out of the way. Or honestly, our recommendation would probably be to not really use them. I'm not sponsored by big Reed diffuser company.
So that's all right.
Yeah, there you go. So those I think are the ones that people don't really think about, and we get common calls about. And then there's the other one that is of great concern that we have, and it's button batteries. And you know what the button batteries are? They're those circular batteries that go into hearing aids, or they go into kids' toys, or they'll go into even like the car remote key fobs, things like that. And so those are really attractive for kids. They're shiny. They're small. Some of them can be small, but they're actually really dangerous if a kid ingests those, because they can get stuck in the esophagus, in the food pipe, and they can actually cause really severe burns.
Wow.
Um, and so those are really, really, really important, that if you're using a product that has a button battery on it, make sure, number one, that it's a product that's got that really obnoxious screw that's in the lid that keeps it in the
Mm.
toy, right? Number one. And number two, if you are changing batteries, button batteries in particular, make sure you have your eyes on them at all times, and you never leave it sitting on the bench top as you're changing things. Because all it takes is one curious kiddo to go and grab it and whoop, in the mouth, and now you've got a real problem.
Yeah, yeah. Gosh, that's pretty concerning. And I've also heard a similar level of concern around small magnets that kids can put inside their mouths.
Yep. So the refrigerator magnets are one. Those are the dark colored magnets,
Uh-huh.
and those can cause some issues. The other ones that we worry about even more so are the neodymium magnets, which are the silver shiny magnets that are the really strong ones.
Right.
And there's some desktop toys a few years ago that I don't think exist here in New Zealand, but you can certainly buy them online, which are just a bunch of these little spheres that are magnetic spheres. And they're sort of fun because you can push them all together and you can make these sort of weird, you know, sculptures and stuff. And they're fun for adults to
Mhm.
play with, but they're super fun for kids to eat. And the problem is, if they do that, then they can get in the intestines, and then they can stick together and sandwich a piece of
Oh.
intestine, and that is obviously a problem there. And so being very mindful about those neodymium magnets in particular, making sure you don't have any of those types of sculpture toys or anything in the household, or small magnets that are available.
Okay, so if I was to come into the room and see that my child had just put a button battery in their mouth and swallowed it,
Mhm.
or some of these magnets, what do we do?
So again, that's an immediate call to the poison center.
Okay.
And just because, again, it's best for us to get a sense of the situation so that we can provide appropriate recommendations, right? A button
Right.
battery ingestion almost always will result in a recommendation for you to go to your nearest emergency department. And we
Yeah.
have some other very specific recommendations that we'll make, while that you should follow while taking your kiddo to the hospital for evaluation for the button batteries themselves. And the reason why we send you to the hospital is because you need to take an X-ray. You need to see where this is at and see where it's located, the size of it, how many, if we're talking about magnets. If you swallow one
Mm,
magnet, it's fine. If you swallow two, that's when the
sure.
problem becomes, right. So
Yeah.
again, but that's what we're here for, is for that, for
Okay.
sure.
Okay. And what about gardening products? I mean, a lot of us have got nice indoor plants and we have to feed them with plant food and fertilizers and things like that. How safe are those products to be in the home?
Yeah. So again, same general principles. Anything that is not food should be kept up out of reach of kiddos, right? And so garden products are just the same, right? The weed killers and the pesticides, those are sort of no brainers. Those should be kept up out of the way. But fertilizers can have their own sort of issues with them as well.
Okay.
And so again, because you don't know necessarily what's in those chemically, it's just best to keep them up and out of the way, right? So that's the chemical side of things. But then there's also the plant side of things, and we get calls about kids eating plants because, again, that's how they're
No,
exploring
we
the
can't
world.
we can't get them to eat their veggies, but they'll eat the plants.
Yeah, broccoli for whatever reason doesn't fall into the category of an attractive
No,
plant.
funny
I don't
that.
understand why. Yeah, so but that's an important thing as well. And I love the flora that's out here in New Zealand, and just the variety of the plant life that's out here, both indoor and outdoor. It's so great.
Mhm.
And I'll be honest with you, Katrina, the plants are foreign to me. I don't know what a lot of these plants
Right.
were when I initially came in, right? And so one of the things that I really enjoyed doing was just taking my phone and going around and taking pictures of a lot of the plants to learn what they were, but then B, to
Mhm.
try to understand if, does my yard have a potentially toxic plant in it that I should be aware of?
Yeah, that's a
Um,
really good idea. And there are different apps that you can get, and even like Google Lens, to take images of the plants around your home and in your garden to see, if they are a risk.
I think it's great, and the fact that those software are now free, right? They come baked into the Android operating system. They come baked into the camera app on the iPhone. It doesn't cost you anything to use them.
Yeah.
And how good they are is, not entirely certain on that. They're pretty good. We're currently
Yeah.
running a study here to try to look at the accuracy specifically related to plants here in New Zealand and how good those
Mm.
apps are. But from just my playing around with them, they seem to do a reasonably good job. And
Yeah.
um, so I think it would be now that things are flowering, it's a lot easier to do the sort of photo identification. It's not just a brown
Yeah.
stick. So so as the light gets nicer out and the weather gets nicer out, it may be a fun thing for people to go around and just get a pad of paper and just do a yard inventory of
Yeah.
interesting looking plants. Take a photo, see what it is, and even if you don't know if poison, not poison, just know what the plant is, so that if a kiddo does get into it, you can give us a call and say,
True.
I think my child ate the flower of this plant, and this is what my app says that it could be. Is this a problem?
Yeah, yeah, that's a really good point. So to have an awareness of what's in the garden before there's a potential event.
Yes. Yes, exactly. Right. Because when the event is happening, you're freaking out and you're going to be less sort of calm and collected about the whole thing. Your mind's going in 8 different directions all at once and everything like that. So having that to fall back on is always great.
Awesome. All righty. So let's talk online shopping. There's
Yes.
definitely been an increase in online shopping. It's becoming increasingly accessible and it's, really affordable. So it is quite an appealing option for families. Um, so I realize that overseas, they might have different safety protocol or criteria, if they have any at all, than we might have here. So what are some of the common things you've come across that might have come from overseas?
Yeah, it's a tricky time in that respect, right? We want to shop like a
Mm.
billionaire through Temu, but we do have to understand the limitations that come with that, right? And so I think the biggest concern that we have is about heavy metals that will show up in paints, typically from sources outside of New Zealand or from um, non-reputable manufacturers, right? And so the biggest concern we have is lead that shows up in things that are
Wow.
typically wooden toys with white paint. Lead is still an issue with that paint, and so that's problematic. And then other art supplies that are out there, finger paints, other cheap um, paints, could also potentially have various heavy metals in them because those metals can be used for pigments, and they're very potent. It doesn't require a whole lot of those metals to create these nice, great pigments, and so it's a really cheap way of mass producing stuff. And
Wow.
so we see that. And the cosmetics, the same sort of deal in that respect. And we do see issues with heavy metals that will show up in cosmetics that come from these mass market vendors, and so it becomes concerning. The challenge is balancing the cheap with um, the safety of it
The
all, and
risk.
understanding
Yeah.
that, yeah, the risk, right? And understanding that there's reasons why there's regulations for product safety that are developed,
Mm.
and we have those regulations in New Zealand. Those are based on World Health Organization regulations, and the
Hmm.
government does a good job in tracking these sort of things and making sure that manufacturers are held accountable to that.
So I was
So
going to say that, like, if I buy art supplies or cheap cosmetics at the warehouse or at Kmart or somewhere else that sells affordable products in New Zealand, the same risks something that I need to be aware of?
probably less likely, right? There's always going to be a
Okay.
thing or two that may slip in, but I think you're in order for it to be sold here in New Zealand, it has
Mhm.
to in order for it to be sold domestically within New Zealand, it has to meet these safety standards. And so that's a really helpful thing to keep in mind. It's when you're buying it online from usually a foreign vendor that those safety standards can be bypassed. There's not the same regulatory authority that comes from all of that. So,
Okay.
one of the things that I've seen most recently, just as a case
Mhm.
example, was there was a call where someone had these water beads. Are you familiar with those?
Oh, like the squishy ones?
Yeah, the squishy ones. So
Orbeez
they're the
kind of
little
beads?
Orbeez. Yeah,
Mm,
exactly. So
mm.
the beads, you put them dry, you put them in the water, and over 24 hours time, they expand out into, these fun, squishy, very sensory friendly sort of things, right? And
Mhm.
New Zealand has strict regulations on the size of those beads that can be sold. And so anything that's bought
Oh,
here in New Zealand at this point in time is generally considered safe if tamariki get into it, right?
oh.
However, we had a call from someone that had purchased a bunch of these from some unknown company out in China, and it came in a vial, if you will, that her kiddo tipped up and swallowed, and it was a large volume of them.
Oh,
And
no.
when I was like, "Oh, show me the picture so that we of the label so we can get a sense of what it was," the whole thing was in Chinese, and we could get zero information from it to understand how big these balls could potentially get and what the risk was related to it, and whether or not there was regulation, on manufacturing that would limit the danger of those. And so it became a really, really
Mm.
challenging situation. Good news is kiddo was fine. We were able to figure everything out, but it took a lot of effort to try to get that figured out, and it took hours to before we could really understand whether or not this was a dangerous thing or a not dangerous thing, which was hours
Yeah.
that mom and dad were fretting the entire time over their child.
Yeah. Yeah, I bet. Absolutely. So, I suppose, each family has to make the decisions for themselves around, the level of risk that they're comfortable with. But the recommendation would be if the child has toys that, developmentally they're more likely to put inside their mouth, perhaps we avoid some of those overseas vendors where the regulations just aren't quite as strict as here.
I think it's a reasonable recommendation, and I make the same recommendation here in New Zealand as I would in the US or in Canada. Regardless, it's the same regulation, the same recommendation based off those safety regulations that are there.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, when we're thinking about things around the home that can be poisonous, we often don't think about medications that we use or medications that are prescribed for tamariki, although these would probably make up some of your most frequent calls to the poison centre. So, I'm just wondering, what advice can you give whānau around managing medications in the home?
So, well, I mean, how much time do we have? We got there's all kinds of recommendations that can be
Sure.
made. I guess there's probably three major recommendations that I think are important. Number one, let's talk for a minute about medications that are supposed to be given to kids, right? Because kids
Sure.
need their medicines, right? And so it's important to know what the medicine is that your child
Mhm.
needs, and to make sure that you understand the dosing of that medication, right? And
Right.
how to administer that medication. So I think in nursing, you talk about the three R's. It's the right child, the right dose, or the right strength, right? And
Mhm.
also, I guess, the right route for that. And so, really making sure that you have an understanding as to what that particular medicine is, and not just that it's the orange bottle or the blue bottle or the white pill or the blue pill or the things
Sure.
like that, right? So that's going
Yeah.
to be really important to know, because we do get a lot of calls about someone who's made a dosing error with respect to these meds that are supposed to be given to kids. And so, again, that's what we're here
Yeah.
for. We're more than happy to help you out with that. But it's also really helpful to talk to your pharmacist, and really make sure you have a good understanding, or your medical provider. So that's that one. I think one of the other things is to also communicate amongst mom and dad or whoever's caring for the kiddo during the day and
Mm.
at night to make sure everyone's on the same page with respect to, my kiddo's got a fever. We're giving him paracetamol for the fever. Let's make sure I understand when caretaker A gave the last dose so that caretaker B isn't potentially doubling up. So that's another thing.
Sure. And I suppose with paracetamol, it can be tricky because it can be something we can get on prescription, in which case it would have the dose in relation to the child's weight. But sometimes it's not that child who's having the paracetamol. It might be a younger sibling. It might be an older sibling, and we're not giving them enough for the medication to be therapeutic. So, how can we work out the dose based upon the child?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's a very important question there. You can go online and very
Okay.
easily Google the appropriate dose of paracetamol for a given weight range. And I think that's probably the easiest thing to do. Don't just guess.
Right.
Look it up. And again, it doesn't take more than a few seconds to be able to look it up and go from there. So that would be my big recommendation, is to make sure that if it's an over-the-counter agent, that you understand how it should be dosed for kiddos. And really, like, technically speaking, if it's prescribed to child A, you shouldn't give it to child B. But I understand how things in reality work. And so that's where using online information is probably helpful.
Okay. And we're talking a bit about paracetamol. Is paracetamol dangerous? Is it a risk?
Yeah, it can be
Okay.
in a large ingestion. It can be problematic, and an extra dose here or there is probably not a big issue, right? There's a large margin of safety that's built into the dosing for paracetamol.
Okay.
When we get more concerned is if kiddo goes and bypasses that child safety cap that we were talking about previously and takes a whole swig of the paracetamol, and now you're well over that potential dose of concern. And again, that's
Mm.
when you give us a call, because then we can do the math for you and tell you whether or not this is an issue.
Yeah, yeah. I had a sister who did that when we were growing up. We didn't get a lot of sweet things, and so she clearly liked the taste of Pamel. And that's, goes back to that temperament thing. Some kids, it's impossible to get it into them, and other kids, they love the taste of Pamel and they will seek it out. And so that's something to be really aware of. Just storing medications in a place where your children cannot reach them.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the other thing is, sometimes the medications that come from the pharmacy may not actually have a child safety cap on it, even if it's the paracetamol or something like that. So do be mindful about that there.
Mm.
So that's
Mm.
one. We're talking about
Yeah.
right medication for kids that are supposed to get the medication, right?
Yeah.
The other thing that we talk about is unused medications, because that's the other major
Okay.
source of exposure. And I think if there's one take home message that we have about medications, is if you're no longer using that medication, it should not be in the house. Period. Right? There's
Okay.
there's there's no reason to to be stocking your medications and have a strategic reserve of
Mm.
your antibiotics or your other medications that maybe you don't need anymore.
Mhm.
And the more that it's just sitting in the house, the more likely it is to eventually be found by a curious, adventurous child. And so
Mm.
if you're no longer using the medication, talk to your pharmacist, and they usually have a way that they can correctly dispose of the medication.
Right. And that, I suppose, is important not just for our own homes. I'm thinking about my grandparents' house, and they have like a medicine like closet full of medications, that they've been tried on different things, and then they've changed the
Yeah.
medications, and they've still got these stockpiled amounts of medications. That's something we can support them with.
I think so. I think it's a great thing it helps you be involved with your family and understand their health, number one. But number
Mhm.
two, I think the older generations really do want to stockpile things and not get rid of things. And it's a dangerous thing to do. And it's the great treasure trove of danger, potentially, that kids can get into. And on top of that, grandparents probably don't have the house child-proof like we had talked about, because there's no
Yeah.
more kids in the house, and so there's no reason for them to want to do that. So they become particularly challenging. And so not only does grandma's handbag have problems, but grandma's hall cupboard has potential for issues. And so if you do let's say you do it every 6 months, you do a stock take of
Mhm.
what medications you're currently on and what medications are in the house that no one's on anymore, then
Mhm.
anyone that's, yeah, if you do that every 6 months, that's great. And then you can take everything to the pharmacist and say, look, we're done with these. We don't need these anymore. Please, my gift to you, Mr. and Mrs. Pharmacist.
Okay, perfect. Alrighty,
Yeah.
so getting rid of unused medications. Are there any other hot tips around medicines?
I think the only other thing to keep in mind is that, going back again to some of the regulation front and safety regulations that we're talking about, is natural medications, holistic
Right.
medications, herbal supplements, all of these sort of things. I think we have the assumption that because it's natural, it's therefore going to be safe. But
Mhm.
I think it's really important to understand that some of those herbal things still have active, molecules in them that can cause a physiologic effect, right? Meaning it's like a drug, right? It's like a medication,
Yeah.
even if it's natural. And so it can do a thing to a person, and a small person, it doesn't take as much to do a thing to, right? So that's number one. But number two is sometimes they're made to be a little bit more attractive and tastier, right? It's hard to get a pharmaceutical company to make a gummy, blood pressure medication. But it's super easy to do that for a natural remedy, right? If only our
Right.
blood pressure medications were tasty. But it's a good thing that our blood pressure medication is not tasty, because that means Junior's not going to necessarily want to get into it quite the same. But if
Mm.
the herbal things are gummies, then that increases the risk of them really going to town on them. And so be mindful of the attractiveness that comes from that. And then the third point on that is also understand that there's a regulatory uh, gap with herbal supplements, and they are not subject
Okay.
to the same regulation and safety standards as pharmaceutical medications. And more, we see these reports happen from time to time where there's actually a pharmaceutical that's within a natural herbal thing, um,
Yeah.
that has been able to get by regulation because it's not tested.
Yeah. Okay. That's something pretty significant to consider, that just because we assume something's natural or it's a supplement, that actually there is still risk.
Yeah, there. Yeah. So same principle should apply. Treat a natural agent as you would any other medication. Keep it up and out of the way. Don't call it
Mhm.
candy. Don't take it in front of the kiddos. Right. All of the things that we've just been talking about.
Okay, got it. Alrighty, so we've been talking a little bit about this, that we have a little bit more control over the things that are in our home, but we can't always control the environment when we're out and about. What advice can you give us when we're visiting whānau, or when they're visiting us?
Yeah, the grandma's handbag, and I don't mean to dog on grandma because grandma's great. We love grandma. But grandma comes with a handbag of mystery and intrigue for kiddos. And
Mm,
so it's not uncommon for grandparents to have medications with them. And it's also not uncommon for grandma and grandma to take those medications out of the little blister packs and put them in something to help them remember how to, like, when to take the medication.
oh
I call it
dear.
a pill minder. It's one of those little daily flippy open things that has, the pills.
Right.
Those aren't child safe. They have a mixture of medications in them. A lot of times
Mm,
we don't know exactly what those medicines are because grandma and grandpa maybe can't remember. They just know they're supposed to take a blue one and a red one and a white one, right?
yeah.
Um, and so there is a lot of potential risk in that respect. And so I think grandpa and grandma should be aware, number one, that their medications really shouldn't be carried around in a handbag, or if they are, to make sure that handbag is not a plaything for the kiddos, right?
Yeah.
So that's the big one. And that even comes with things like hand sanitizer and stuff like that. Um,
Mm,
so, and then the other one that we sort of talked about a little bit is grandpa and grandma's household, right? And we
Mm,
don't want grandpa and grandma to not be able to get into their closets and get into their drawers and the things like that. So it's unreasonable to expect that they childproof everything just for an occasional
mm.
visit. But again, maybe it's one of those things that you call grandpa and grandma before you come by and have a visit and say, "Hey, we're bringing Junior over. Can you just make sure that your medicines are up and out of the way?"
Yeah, yeah, that's great advice. And I was just reflecting, thinking about the other places where we take our kids. And we can't assume that they follow, really strict standards about storage of cleaning products. Specifically, I'm thinking, where we take our kids maybe to dancing or gymnastics or, to different groups. There are often cleaning products around and potential risks for our little people.
Yeah, and that really just comes down to the fact of just being vigilant to know if you know what the risks are in your household and you're attentive to all of that sort of stuff, then you'll start to see those in other places that you go. And when you go to the bathroom at your local cafe, you'll see the bottle of bleach sitting on the floor because that's where they store it, and that's
Yeah.
fine. But that's what they're going to do. Hopefully, you don't have your 2-year-old in the bathroom on their own unsupervised at one of these
Yeah.
places. But it is interesting once you start paying attention to see all that sort of stuff. And so again, that goes back to modeling behavior, making sure that you're not modeling, the usage and opening of containers and stuff like that.
Yeah. And I suppose it's an opportunity for us as parents to advocate for our kids and say, hey, I'm not sure if you've realized, but having that cleaner on the floor in the bathroom, it's a little bit risky with little kids being around, and giving them the opportunity to be educated on the topic and to move it. Because again, if they're not in the time or space of life where they have little people, this stuff kind of goes off the radar for you.
Sure, absolutely. No, I think that's an excellent point. That's a great point. Advocacy and sharing education within our community. It does take a village to raise a family, as it is, and it's good to be involved in that village. And I think that's a fabulous point.
Cool. All righty. So we've talked a lot about ways to keep pepe and tamariki safe, but it's also important to revisit the meds if you are hapu. So what medications you're allowed to take, or you shouldn't take, or you have to take in a different way if you are pregnant. So what would you
Mhm.
recommend pregnant people to do?
That's a great point. So I think this should be a part of the conversation that you have with your provider during pregnancy, is understanding which medications are safe to take while you're pregnant. But
Mhm.
sometimes doctors are busy, clinic's busy. It may fall off the radar of things, that come up in average conversation. So I think it's always just really important to take a beat and say, hey, before we're done, I just want to make sure that the medicines that I'm on are still okay for me to take while I'm pregnant, just as a quick reminder. And then also the question of, now, say you've got a cold or something of that nature, and you feel like you're miserable and you want to take some over the counter something or other. That's,
Mhm.
again, it's important to just very casually bring that up to the pharmacist and say, hey, I'm pregnant. Is it safe for me to take this? Right.
Yeah, right.
Um,
Is that something we can call the poison line about as well?
it would be something, we would prefer, talking to your provider and to
Okay,
your pharmacist related to that, because that's part of your overall general healthcare as it is, and your
sure.
general course and everything. So I think that would be a better thing to direct for those sort of those are planning questions more than anything, right? Is really, it's part of that sort of useful, pregnancy checklist that you have as part of
Mhm.
your overall care. So I think it's a really good thing. Plus, if you're not disclosing certain medications that you're on to your provider while you're pregnant, that is, you're not giving them the full story, and they really do need to know all of the things.
Yeah, sure, that
So
could be potentially
yeah,
problematic.
right, right. And
And
then
then
and then I guess, I'm sorry, go for it.
no, I was about to say, and then we have this precious baby and hopefully have success with breastfeeding. So the same would go. There would be different considerations for those who are breastfeeding.
Yeah, it's true. And certain medications that you were on while you were pregnant, you may not be on afterwards, or more likely, there were certain medications that you may have been on prior to being pregnant that you had to stop
Right.
taking while pregnant, that you may then resume post pregnancy. right? Or medications that you may have to start taking because of some issue that you had during pregnancy or during birth. Let's say, pain medication is an obvious thing to talk about. And so it's again, it's a really important thing to do all of this in advance. And so part of your pre-birth checklist, part of your pre-birth sort of, you know, birthing story that you're wanting to do, um, should really be about what medications can I take of my list that I'm on while I'm breastfeeding, and
Mhm.
have that conversation ahead of time. I think that's a really good thing. I want to really bring that up before breastfeeding, because I don't want anything to get in the way of people to breastfeed, because it is a really, really, really important thing, um, for baby and for mom and for that connection. And there's so many benefits for the breastfeeding that I don't want there to be any doubt that anyone has in real time.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's really great. That's a really great point. We want to do what we can to be able to support and promote breastfeeding for the whole whānau, so that's awesome.
Right.
Hey, we've
Absolutely.
had one question pop up in the chat. It says, at what age should we start baby proofing in terms of locking cupboards, etc.?
Yeah, so roughly around 6 months is when kiddos start to develop those motor skills where they can start to get into trouble. Again,
Right.
because we've talked about kids are going to potentially surprise you, I would do that well ahead of 6 months. And so that first 3 month window, I think, is that window that would be the most important to make those considerations and those preparations.
Yeah, cool. And if you're wondering about your child's development, that's something you can talk to your tamariki ora, your whānau nurse about, and say, so what's coming up next developmentally? What do I need to prepare for? Because yeah, things developmentally can happen, and you're not expecting them. You think, oh my goodness, I wasn't expecting this baby to be moving so young, or whatever it might be. So have a chat with your Plunket nurse, give Plunket Line a call. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, they can support you in some of that decision making about keeping Pepe safe.
Perfect. That's excellent.
Awesome. Hey, I want to just extend the warmest thanks to you for coming and sharing in your wisdom and your experiences. I bet you have some pretty crazy work stories. But what an amazing opportunity to learn from your experience and your expertise for all of the whānau who tuned in today. So ngā mihi, thank you so much.
I really appreciate the opportunity to chat about all this stuff. This is our passion here at the Poison Center, and we love to be able to talk about it. We are uber nerds as far as things go, and our goal is to really make sure that everyone is safe and healthy as the tamariki age. That's what Poison Center started, was because of kids at this high risk age, and we want everyone to be able to be relaxed and really enjoy kids as they grow and not be fearful of everything that's potentially around. And so offload that burden to us. That's what we're here for. Never hesitate to give us a call. We'd love to talk with you, and I really appreciate the opportunity to come and chat with you guys. It's been wonderful.
Fantastic. And thank you to all of you who have tuned in today. I hope it's been useful. I hope you've learned so much. And if nothing else, take away with you, the Poison Centre is available for your call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And as Dr. Bill said, this is not your burden to carry. They are here to support you. All righty. Ka kite.
Okay. Nami.